April 18, 1945, near the Elbe River, western Germany. The convoy of Wehrmacht Helferinnen trucks sputtered to a halt as American soldiers materialized from the tree line. Weapons raised. 37 women in field gray uniforms stepped down onto muddy ground, hands slowly lifting skyward. For the past 6 months, these communications and anti-aircraft auxiliaries had been told what would happen if they were captured. The Americans would show no mercy. They would starve prisoners. They would commit unspeakable acts. Every one of them had heard the warnings from their officers, from the Ministry of Propaganda, from Goebbels himself. Capture meant death. But, as you'll discover in the next 20 minutes, every single word was a lie. These women were about to encounter something their ideology had never prepared them for, an abundance so overwhelming. A treatment so humane, and a reality so different from everything they believed, that it would shatter their entire worldview in a matter of days. If you're watching from Germany, the United States, the United Kingdom, or anywhere else in the world, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're joining us from. This is a story about the moment propaganda collided with reality. And in that moment, standing in the muddy field as American soldiers approached with cigarettes instead of cruelty, they understood something their commanders had desperately tried to hide. Germany had already lost this war not on the battlefield, but at the factory, the farm, and the dinner table. The journey to that field near the Elbe began years earlier, when the Wehrmacht first started recruiting women into auxiliary roles. By November 1944, over 500,000 German women served as Wehrmachtshelferin female auxiliaries, performing communications work, anti-aircraft operations, and administrative duties. They were called Blitzmädchen, lightning girls, for the signal flashes on their uniforms. They were taught that service to the Reich was the highest calling, and they were told, repeatedly and insistently, that the Americans were a decadent, weak nation of gangsters and capitalists who would treat German prisoners with barbaric cruelty. The propaganda was specific and relentless. American soldiers, they learned, were barely trained civilians thrown into uniform. The United States was a mongrel nation without culture or discipline. Its industrial capacity was exaggerated. Its wealth was a facade. Most importantly, any German who fell into American hands would suffer terribly. These weren't casual warnings. They were official policy, designed to keep German forces fighting to the bitter end. The women believed every word. They had no reason not to. But by April 1945, the reality on the ground told a different story. The Wehrmacht was collapsing. Supply lines had disintegrated. German rations, which had provided 4,500 calories per day in 1940, had plummeted to barely 1,670 calories by the winter of 1944-45. The women in the communications units went to bed hungry more nights than not. Black bread and rutabaga soup had become luxuries. Coffee was a distant memory, replaced by roasted acorn substitutes that tasted like dirt. Meat appeared once every few weeks, if at all. The American soldiers who stopped their convoy on April 18th didn't match the propaganda descriptions. They weren't savage or undisciplined. They were calm, professional, and surprisingly young. One offered a pack of Lucky Strikes to the senior German woman, a Nachrichtenfelin named Marguerite, who had coordinated radio communications for an artillery division. She stared at the cigarettes like they were hallucinations. Real tobacco, American tobacco. The soldier smiled and gestured for her to take them. She did, hands trembling. Not from fear, from confusion. This wasn't how enemies were supposed to behave. The women were loaded onto American trucks and driven to a temporary holding facility near Halberstadt. During the ride, they whispered to each other in hushed German, trying to make sense of what they were experiencing. The American trucks were new, well-maintained, and moved smoothly over roads that German vehicles hadn't been able to navigate in months. Every truck ran perfectly. Every engine hummed with mechanical confidence. One of the women, a 19-year-old flak auxiliary named Hild, counted the vehicles in the American convoy and stopped at 50. All functional, all fueled. The Wehrmacht could barely keep 5 trucks operational at the same time anymore. They arrived at the holding facility as dusk settled over the German countryside. They expected barbed wire and guard towers. They found them but also barracks with intact roofs, working electric lights, and a mess hall that smelled of cooking food. Real food. The aroma hit them before they even left the trucks. Roasted meat, fresh bread, coffee, actual coffee. Hild started crying without meaning to. She hadn't smelled coffee in 2 years. The American camp commander, a captain named Mitchell from Ohio, addressed them through a German-speaking interpreter. He explained that, under the Geneva Convention, they would be treated with all regard due to their status and sex. They would receive the same rations as American soldiers. They would not be forced to work. They would have access to medical care. Any violation of their rights should be reported immediately. The women listened in stunned silence. They had expected threats and intimidation. They received bureaucratic courtesy. Then came dinner. The mess hall doors opened, and the women filed in like they were walking into a dream. Long tables laden with metal trays, American soldiers serving food with mechanical efficiency. And the food itself, mountains of it. Each woman received a dinner tray containing mashed potatoes with butter, a thick slice of roast beef, canned green beans, white bread with jam, coffee with real sugar, and a Hershey's chocolate bar. The portions were enormous. The beef alone weighed more than an entire day's ration in the Wehrmacht. Marguerite stared at her tray for a full minute, unable to process what she was seeing. Then she picked up her fork and took a bite of the beef. She later described that moment in a Red Cross interview conducted weeks after the war ended. The taste was so rich, so overwhelming, that she thought she might be sick. Her body had forgotten what real meat tasted like. The fat, the protein, the saltite was more than her system could handle after months of near starvation. She ate slowly, forcing herself to take small bites, while around her other women wept openly into their mashed potatoes. Not from sadness, from the shattering realization that everything they'd been told was inverted. Hild couldn't finish her meal, not because she wasn't hungry, she was desperately hungry, but because her stomach had shrunk so much that it couldn't hold the volume of food on the tray. She wrapped the chocolate bar in a napkin and hid it in her pocket, an instinct from months of scarcity. Then she realized the American soldier clearing tables wasn't stopping her. He saw the chocolate disappear into her pocket and didn't say a word. She would get another chocolate bar tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. That first night, the women lay in bunks with clean mattresses and actual blankets, and they talked in whispers about what they were experiencing. Marguerite did the math aloud. A ration provided 3,700 calories per day. They had just eaten dinner from the mess hall, which meant they were getting the same rations as American soldiers. For comparison, Wehrmacht rations in early 1945 provided roughly 1,670 calories, and even those were rarely delivered in full. The Americans were feeding their prisoners more than twice what German soldiers were eating. One of the women asked the obvious question, how is this possible? The answer was floating unspoken in the darkness of the barracks. They could afford it because America's industrial capacity was exactly what the propaganda said didn't exist. Over the following days and weeks, the cognitive dissonance intensified. The camp received a delivery of Red Cross packages. Each woman was given a box containing cigarettes, coffee, canned meat, chocolate, soap, and condensed milk. Actual soap that lathered coffee that tasted like coffee, cigarettes made from real tobacco, not hay and sawdust. Hild opened her Red Cross package and found a small can of Spam. She had never seen Spam before, but she recognized the metal can as American. She opened it with shaking hands and ate half the can standing in the barracks. The salty meat was paradise. The American guards treated them with professional courtesy that bordered on indifference. They weren't cruel, but they weren't particularly interested either. They had a job to secure the prisoners, maintain order, process paperwork. The women had expected to be objects of hatred or lust. They were objects of bureaucratic routine. One guard, a farm boy from Iowa named Miller, distributed mail and packages with the same bored efficiency he'd shown distributing ammunition 6 months earlier. When Marguerite asked him, through the interpreter, why the Americans fed prisoners so well, he looked genuinely confused by the question. Geneva Convention says, we gotta feed you same as our guys, he said. So that's what we do. It wasn't generosity, it wasn't propaganda, it was simply policy, executed with the same industrial efficiency that defined everything about the American war effort. By the 3rd week of captivity, the women's bodies had begun to recover from months of malnutrition. Their cheeks filled out, their energy returned. They could finish entire meal trays without feeling sick, and with physical recovery came a deeper, more unsettling transformation. They started asking questions. If the Americans could feed hundreds of thousands of prisoners this well, how much food did America actually have? If every truck in the convoy ran perfectly, how many trucks did America have? If chocolate bars were distributed casually to prisoners, what did that say about American industrial capacity? Marguerite began observing the American guards more carefully. She noticed their uniforms were standardized, well-made, and recently issued. She noticed they changed socks, daily actual clean socks, distributed through supply channels. She noticed they received letters from home wrapped in real paper, not the recycled pulp Germany had been using since 1943. She noticed they complained about the coffee being too weak, which meant they had enough coffee to afford preferences. She noticed they threw away cigarettes that were only half smoked. Every detail was a data point. Every casual waste of resources was evidence of an industrial base that Germany could never match. One afternoon, in early May, after Germany's formal surrender, Marguerite sat on a bench outside the barracks with two other women. They were drinking real coffee and eating white bread with butter, actual butter, not margarine. An American supply truck drove past one of dozens that rolled through the camp every day, delivering food and mail and equipment with mechanical regularity. Marguerite watched it disappear down the road and said quietly, "We never had a chance, did we?" The other women didn't answer. They didn't need to. The coffee in their hands was answer enough. Hild later wrote about this period in letters to her sister, letters that were preserved in family archives. She described the chocolate as obscene, not because it was bad, but because it was good, and there was so much of it, and she had been taught that such abundance was impossible in wartime. She described watching American soldiers casually toss away half-eaten chocolate bars and feeling a rage so intense she had to walk away. Not rage at the soldiers, but rage at her own government for lying so comprehensively and for so long. The camp's medical officer, a German-speaking army doctor named Weiss, whose parents had emigrated from Bavaria in the 1920s, conducted examinations of the women during their first weeks in captivity. He found evidence of chronic malnutrition in nearly all of them: thinning hair, brittle nails, vitamin deficiencies, and delayed healing from minor injuries. He prescribed extra rations and vitamin supplements. Within a month, the symptoms began reversing. Marguerite's hair, which had been falling out since January, stopped shedding. Hild's perpetual fatigue disappeared. Their bodies were recovering from what the German war economy had done to them. By June 1945, the holding facility near Halberstadt was being reorganized for repatriation. The women would be returned to Germany, to what remained of Germany, and released to rebuild their lives in the ruins. Before they left, Captain Mitchell conducted exit interviews. He asked each woman what surprised her most about captivity. Marguerite answered immediately: the waste. She explained that she had watched American soldiers throw away food that would have fed a Wehrmacht company for days. She had seen perfectly good equipment discarded because newer models were available. "You fight like you have infinite resources," she told Mitchell through the interpreter. "Because you do." Hild's answer was simpler. "Everything. Everything surprised me, because everything we were told was a lie." She didn't elaborate, but Mitchell understood. He had heard similar sentiments from hundreds of German prisoners over the past months. The realization that propaganda had inverted reality was universal among those who survived to reach American captivity. The women left the camp in early July, riding American trucks back toward what remained of their homes. They carried their belongings in Red Cross bags, supplemented with extra rations that the Americans distributed for the journey. Each woman received a final care package containing coffee, chocolate, cigarettes, and canned goods, enough food to last a week. It's casually distributed to enemy prisoners heading home. Marguerite kept her chocolate bar unopened for 3 days, then finally ate it while sitting in the ruins of a Dresden train station. The sweetness was jarring against the backdrop of rubble and ash. Years later, historians would analyze the American treatment of German POWs as a case study in psychological warfare through generosity. By adhering strictly to the Geneva Convention and feeding prisoners the same rations as American soldiers, the U.S. created a propaganda victory that no leaflet could match. German prisoners returned home with stories of abundance that contradicted every piece of Nazi propaganda. The message spread organically. America was exactly as powerful as it claimed, and Germany had never stood a chance. But for the women who experienced it firsthand, it wasn't psychological warfare or strategic messaging. It was chocolate and coffee and meat and butter and the profound, disorienting experience of having your entire worldview shattered by a Hershey bar. They had given everything to a government that starved them and lied to them and sent them into an unwinnable war. And when they finally met the enemy, they'd been taught to fear. The enemy fed them better than their own country ever had. Marguerite lived until 1987, dying in a small apartment in what was then West Germany. Among her possessions, her niece found a faded Lucky Strikes pack, empty but carefully preserved, wrapped in tissue paper in a wooden box. That was the first thing an American soldier gave her, her sister explained. When she was captured, she said it was the moment she knew everything she believed was wrong. The war had been decided by mathematics, not mythology. For every barrel of oil Germany produced, America produced 54. Every tank Germany manufactured, America built 5. The numbers were relentless and unforgiving. Germany mobilized every resource, strained every supply line, and pushed its people to starvation in pursuit of victory. America mobilized a fraction of its capacity and still overwhelmed the Third Reich with surplus resources. The German women imprisoned near Halberstadt didn't need a history book to understand this. They understood it every time they sat down to eat. The final irony was that the American guards weren't particularly impressive as individuals. They weren't supermen or propaganda heroes. They were farmers and mechanics and store clerks in uniform, doing their jobs with minimal enthusiasm. But they had chocolate in their pockets, and cigarettes to spare, and trucks that never broke down. They were ordinary men backed by extraordinary logistics. And logistics, it turned out, won wars more decisively than valor or ideology or any other romantic notion the Third Reich had promoted. The women returned to a Germany that barely existed. Cities were rubble. Infrastructure was destroyed. Food was scarce, and would remain scarce for years. Marguerite found her family's apartment in Hamburg reduced to a pile of bricks. Hild discovered her hometown had been firebombed into oblivion. They rebuilt their lives in the ruins, sustained by the bitter knowledge that the war had been unwinnable from the start. The propaganda had promised them destiny. Reality had delivered them defeat and a Hershey bar. Decades after the war, when Germany had recovered and rebuilt itself into an economic powerhouse, survivors like Marguerite and Hild would occasionally speak to historians or students about their experiences. They would describe the hunger, the propaganda, the capture, and the chocolate. And they would emphasize one point above all others: the moment they realized Germany had lost wasn't when Hitler died, or when Berlin fell, or when the surrender was signed. It was when an American guard offered them a cigarette. And they understood that a nation with cigarettes to spare for its enemies was a nation that had already won. The sound of trucks delivering supplies to the camp, the mechanical reliability of American equipment, the casual abundance of food that could be distributed to prisoners without strain, these were the sounds and sights of victory. Not the dramatic romantic victory of propaganda films, but the grinding mathematical victory of industrial capacity and logistical superiority. It was victory measured in chocolate bars and coffee rations and clean socks and mail delivery. It was victory that didn't need to announce itself because it was self-evident in every meal.